Hi folks, it's Mikel Weisser. I'm the staff reporter for Cannabiz News, and I am exhilarated to welcome you to this week's episode of the Keith Stroup Show. Ladies and gentlemen, the star of our show, Mr. Keith Stroup, launched the entire marijuana movement as the founder of NORML back in 1970, and he's still in the trenches fighting in Washington, D.C. for marijuana freedom every day. If you were keeping track at home, you may notice that it's a busy week. So busy, in fact, that I'm actually not here for this week's episode. We taped this 2 weeks ago and put it in the can. That's full disclosure, right, Keith?
I think so. You're covered.
Yep, we gotta let them know what's going on. I'm actually out in Florida for the Southeast Cannabis Conference and Expo, Florida's first major marijuana exhibition. And I was on the phone today with the office of John Morgan, and he may be our feature speaker. I don't know then, because it hasn't happened yet.
And by the way, Michael, I just had a call. I think I may end up being down there with you, but I haven't finalized it yet. So I guess we're both looking ahead.
Well, that would be great. We'll have live coverage of that during the week of the weekend of June 9th through the 11th. In the meantime, though, we had Keith on the line and wanted to talk to him about some of the history of NORML and how we got to today. I was going to start with a just basic old question, Keith. Now, I grew up in a marijuana community, and by the time I was 18, I was ready to smoke. How did you first get involved with marijuana?
Well, I certainly didn't grow up in a marijuana community. I grew up on a small family farm in southern Illinois, and my parents were devout Southern Baptists. So I can assure you that it was not a marijuana-friendly environment. And I honestly don't remember even knowing about marijuana in high school, although it may have been around and I was oblivious. We were into drinking underage, of course. And when I got to college, I was in a fraternity, and I was drinking a lot. But there were a subset in the fraternity who were clearly smoking, more the artsy-craftsy types. And
what year was this?
61 to 65. I was at the University of Illinois. And, it was still a little early in the marijuana movement, so it hadn't really surfaced in a public way. But up close, you would run into, if you went to any fraternity parties, there'd be a few people taking a walk outside to share a joint or something. So I was aware of it, but strangely enough, I wasn't even interested to find out about it. It was only after I got to law school, and frankly, it was because of the war in Vietnam. I was radicalized, and I think most people of my age were radicalized because, again, I graduated college and started law school in 1965, and that was sort of the height of the Vietnam War, and the anti-Vietnam War movement had become massive by that time. It continued to grow. I think the peak was in 68, the year I graduated. And at that point, they didn't even have a lottery, so you didn't have the luxury of hoping you got a high number and wouldn't get drafted. If you were male and 18 or older, if you were not a full-time student, you were drafted. Now, back then, women were not drafted, were not somebody couldn't even volunteer. So it was a total male thing, but it was, instead of like World War II, where I think there was a great patriotic fervor. Oh, in the Vietnam time, there was an enormous movement in America saying, why are we in this war? Exactly.
Oh, yes.
Why are we fighting in Vietnam? And I think we ended up losing, I forget, but 55 or 60,000 young Americans, plus hundreds of thousands of people with arms and legs missing and, terribly wounded vets. And again, I must admit that for me, I just didn't want to go to Vietnam and have my ass shot off. I mean, I was also anti-war, but I had a personal stake in it. So at any event, I had already been ordered to take my physical, and I did, and I passed it, and I'd been given my date to report. And it was only 2 or 3 weeks off, so I was pretty well set that I was going to Vietnam. When, with the help of some National Lawyers Guild attorneys, I had filed for what was called a critical skills deferment. I'm sorry if I'm getting too deep in the woods, but this is all relevant.
Is that because you were an attorney?
Well, it was not that. I'd been hired as I graduated Georgetown. I'd been hired by a presidential commission called the National Commission on Product Safety, and it sounded important. And it was a national commission, and Congress and President appointed people and all of that.
Is that the Ralph Nader folks?
Yes, indeed it was. Now, it wasn't Ralph directly, but it was created by Congress because of Ralph entirely. And so it was actually Senator Warren Magnuson from Washington State who was the major sponsor. Well, in any event, it was a fairly small group, but they held hearings for a couple of years and identified unsafe products in and around the home, and we would hold hearings and notify Congress, and they would propose legislation. Well, what I learned during those 2 years was that public interest law was something I'd never heard of, but it was a fascinating option. Instead of using your legal skills or your law degree to get rich or to help your clients get rich or, as a criminal defense lawyer to help them stay out of jail, all of those of which are fine reasons. I enjoy being a lawyer no matter what version. But what really seemed exhilarating was the idea that you could use your legal skills to try to impact public policy. It just hadn't been thought of before Ralph Nader came to town. If you remember, he wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed about the Corvair, and then he came to town and he had Nader's Raiders every year coming to town to help him, and he was really doing some very positive work, and I thought, man, that's what I'd like to do. And so when the commission ended after 2 years, I was old enough, I couldn't be drafted. I was 29. And I thought, well, I want to do public interest law, but I didn't care really about product safety. I'd started smoking grass when I was a freshman at Georgetown in 1965. So the issue that seemed most relevant to my life, and again, keep in mind, I'd been radicalized by the Vietnam War, and once you began to question the government's policy about Vietnam, you began to look at other policies and saying, man, these guys, the emperor has no clothes, And so I ended up founding NORML in late 1970, and it was entirely because of a combination of being radicalized because I was facing the draft for Vietnam, and my experience working around Ralph Nader and being introduced to the concept of public interest law. So it was a coincidence of time. But to be honest, if it would have been a different time, I had been raised on a farm, and I would have probably simply gone back to the town I was raised in and practiced law and had a boring life. I'm delighted that didn't happen, but I'm saying that's the path I think I was on until the Vietnam War came along, and of course after that there was no turning back.
Shout out to this week's sponsor, ultratrust.net, for their support. Rocco Beatrice Sr., the founder of UltraTrust, is one of the nation's foremost experts on asset protection. His articles can be seen in USA Today, ABC News, CBS News, Fox News, and many more. Rocco can help you protect your assets from seizure, creditors, legal actions of all kinds, and hide them from prying eyes. Visit Rocco online at ultratrust.net, where you can download his free report, Managing the Risk of Loss, and learn numerous ways to protect your assets. That's ultratrust.net, ultratrust.net. Well, Ralph Nader is one of the cultural icons that shaped your early work. There's another cultural icon from the 1960s that also had a key role in helping you found NORML, and I'm talking about Hugh Hefner.
Well, real quickly, we can't go into all of them right now, but Hugh Hefner did, Ramsey Clark did, and Tom Forssad, the founder of High Times Magazine, did. Hunter Thompson was a major player in those years. But you're right, Hugh Hefner was important because he gave us our first funding.
You go.
When you come up with an idea for a public interest project, it may be insightful or creative or brilliant or whatever, but if you don't have money, then unless you're a wealthy individual, you're not going to be able to spend much time on it. You're going to have a day job. And so when I started NORML, I didn't have a day job. I was just finishing my job at the commission. And I was really nervous about whether what I was doing was a good step or not. And I had read Ramsey Clark's book, Crime in America. It came out in 70, I think. And in it, Ramsey Clark, for those who are listening who might not remember, he was Attorney General under his father, under Lyndon Johnson. His father had been on the Supreme Court.
There you go.
Yeah, but he came from royalty, basically, in this country. You know, he'd been in the he'd been in the cabinet. His father had been on the Supreme Court. He being Attorney General, but at some point he became very anti-war, and he resigned his position as Attorney General. And if you remember, he and who was the woman, Jane Fonda, became symbols for the anti-Vietnam War movement. They actually made a trip together to Hanoi, and oh my goodness, people were they were so hateful towards both of them for years and years. And Ramsey truly was one of the most high-minded individuals I've ever had the pleasure of meeting at any event. I wanted to go talk to Ramsey because in his book, Crime in America, he had called for legalizing marijuana. And I was getting cold feet. I was thinking, man, I don't know if this is smart or not. Maybe I should just take a job with a law firm. So it took a while, but after 2 or 3 weeks, I managed to get an appointment to go see Ramsey. And he was wonderful. He said 2 things. He said, first off, do it because it's important. And number 2, do it while you're young because, you know, if you fall on your face, you can get up and start again. You don't yet have a family or you don't have obligations that might keep you from taking those kinds of chances. And he said to me, he says, by the way, have you applied to the Playboy Foundation for funding?
What?
And I said, well, I've never heard of the Playboy Foundation, to be honest. Well, it turns out Ramsey Clark had his profile published or interview published in Playboy at some point. And I said, should I do this? And he said, Keith, I've written books. I've been Attorney General. And when I travel around the world, people very seldom mention that they read one of my books or that they remember me as Attorney General. They mentioned they read my Playboy interview. Because back then, I think Playboy had 6 million issues a month were sold or something.
Well, I got to admit, it's been about 40 years, but I read your 1970s Playboy interview, and that was one of the first things that stuck in my mind when we met.
Well, you're right. I think that was in 75 or 76. But at the time, of course, I couldn't even imagine that I would have one. But I was totally reinforced by Ramsey Clark's statement that it's important to do and do it now. And while you're at it, why don't you contact the Playboy Foundation and tell them I'm behind you guys. And I said, well, would you be willing to serve on our advisory board? And he couldn't for the first few months because he was doing some civil rights work. He wanted to make sure it wasn't going to undermine that. He did, right. After a few months, by the way. He did serve on our advisory board for, a decade or so and was a major player, spoke at several of our conferences. But the key point I'm getting to is that with Ramsey's support, I ended up getting invited out to the Playboy Foundation to meet with Hefner and the foundation board. They offered us a small token amount of money. The first time, I think it was $5,000. And, there was a side of me saying, man, that's too small to even take. I don't know if I should say yes or not. But then, my more ambitious side said, well, if we got $5,000 now, we do a good job, there'll be more. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. We developed a very tight relationship with the Playboy Foundation. Within a few months, they were giving us $100,000 a year in direct cash and 2 full-time or full-page ads in Playboy magazine, which back then, were, worth $60,000 or more. And they covered things we did in the section of the magazine called the Forum. So if we would get some poor Missouri college student out of prison, which we did at some point, and they covered it with great coverage, and everything we did of any consequence, they would report on. And so long before the Washington Post or New York Times or some of those began to give us exposure, Playboy was already doing it. So it was a terribly important ally to have. And to this day, I haven't seen Hef for a few years, but I've stayed in touch with him from a distance, and I'm still appreciative of the support he gave us during those years.
So one of the famous stories about your wild and woolly early days talks about how you met Hunter S. Thompson at the Doral Hotel. I think we have time if you want to tell people that story.
I'd be happy
hilarious.
to. It's storytelling time, and I'm a lawyer, and lawyers love a bully pulpit. So, but this I like because first off, Hunter's been dead now. I think 10 years. It'll be 11 years later this year, I think. And he was a dear friend. I met him in '72, and I knew him until his death 10 years ago. He was a fabulous man to be a friend of. He was creative. He was entertaining. You never knew quite what to expect. There was once when he called me, needed some help, and wanted me to fly out to his place in Aspen, and I flew out and landed at Aspen Airport and called him up and said, Doc, I'm going to jump in a taxi. I'm coming right out. It's only about 10 minutes from the airport. And he said, okay. Well, I got out there, and the gate was closed, and I couldn't raise it. So I started climbing over the gate. Well, Hunter started running out of the house with guns blazing, shooting over my head. And to this day, I don't think he was trying to shoot me. I think it was just part of the Hunter.
I think he was trying to shoot
me. Because I think if he was trying, he would have done it. But at any event, it was that there was always a degree of danger in your friendship with Hunter because he was unconventional, and you never knew what was next. The way I actually met him, I was the first night of the Democratic Convention in 1972, and I had driven down the NORML crowd. There were 4 or 5 of us, including the one member of the executive director of the Playboy Foundation. She was a good friend at the time, and she went with us on that trip. And so we go down there. We're all like 6 of us staying in one hotel room trying to save money. And, and then we drive down to the major hotels. It was the Doral Hotel where George McGovern had his headquarters, and that's where we wanted to be.
That was he was the candidate in 1972.
Yes, indeed, and he was the candidate who ended up winning only one state. I'm sorry to say, but we thought at the time that this was a good horse to ride, and he was as to our issue. At any event, the very first night of the convention, I was sitting in the bleachers. There was a section set aside for visitors, not delegates, so I wasn't as close as some people, and I smelled marijuana. And, being
at the convention?
And being a doper, I thought, no, wait a minute, I know damn well that's marijuana. So I looked down between my legs. It was kind of open bleachers like you might have at a high school gym, but a little taller. And I saw this gangly, tall guy who I'd seen in Rolling Stone, and he was clearly smoking a joint. And I thought, God damn, it's Hunter Thompson. And at the time, Hunter's Fear and Loathing book had not been published, but it had been serialized in Rolling Stone. And so I'd seen pictures, and he had been published a lot in Rolling Stone. He was beginning to be famous. He wasn't as famous then as he got to be later. But at any event, I found my way down through under the bleachers and walked up to him and introduced myself. And he was kind of awkward because, he didn't expect anybody would interrupt him. He was down there having a little private smoke. and I said, I'm with NORML. We're a marijuana lobby. And I stuck up my hand, and he handed me the joint. And we started up a friendship that, frankly, lasted until his death. He was a fascinating man in all ways. He, as I say, I think what I most enjoyed about him was that he was, you never knew for sure what to expect when you went to his place. And I used to at least once a year try to go out to Aspen. I would act like I had a business reason to be there, but I was really there because I wanted to go spend a couple of nights at Hunter's place. And when you'd be at Hunter's house, once you're there, it's like you're in his cocoon, and he's got an ounce of cocaine, and he's got a fifth of wild turkey, and I'd bring an ounce of marijuana. Of course, he'd have his own anyway, and we would sit there and tell war stories and do drugs until maybe 2 a.m, and I just couldn't do it anymore. I was out. That's
Roberto Duran. No mas.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so I would get in my car and limp back to Aspen to my hotel, and he would wake his assistant up and go to work, because that's the shape Hunter got into every day when he went to work. He didn't
Kids,
work.
don't try this at home.
No, I wouldn't recommend it for anyone, but I will tell you that Hunter, that persona that he sold to the public was really quite real. He was a madman, but he was so creative and so, well, I think he was the most creative man of my generation. I don't know anyone who's had such an impact as Hunter has.
Now, thanks to your initial relationship with Hunter S. Thompson, NORML still has a connection to Aspen, Colorado. You guys have an event coming up, don't you?
We sure do. It's the NORML 2017 NORML Aspen Legal Seminar. We've been going there, I think, every year for 12 or more years. We have one, by the way, in early December in Key West, and we've been going for like 36 or 37 years. So there's some tradition in these. In Aspen, it's a wonderful time. I just think we're in there in the in-between seasons when it's not full of Hollywood types and stuff, and you can get a dinner reservation any place. You don't have a problem. And one night we have a lovely dinner at the home of Chris and Jerry Goldstein. He's a prominent NORML legal committee attorney, former president of NACDL, etc. A beautiful home there. And then on Saturday afternoon, we go out to Hunter Thompson's farm. It's called Owl Farm, and his widow has us out there as her guests. And we have a cookout with some live country music. It's really a wonderful thing. We all end up during the afternoon getting stoned and going up to where Hunter's ashes were shot off. If you remember.
Shot off? What do you mean?
Well, I think, wasn't it Sean Penn who took over and handled that for Anita Thompson? Hunter wanted his ashes shot into the sky. And so Sean spent, I think a couple $1 million or something building this big rocket and fired Hunter's ashes into the sky. Now, some of the ashes were also buried there on the land. And so anyway, it's sort of, for those who admire Hunter Thompson, it's sort of hallowed ground.
So when is the Aspen NORML Legal Conference this year?
It's June 1, 2, and 3, and I don't know whether that will have occurred by the time this program airs or not.
Well, between your conference and my conference, we've got this new episode in the can. So, folks, now you know why we didn't talk about anything current, because we were covering our bases. That really is about all the time we have for today's episode. If you thought that the work that NORML is doing, certainly the lifestyle sounds quite entertaining. And if you think the work is noble and exciting and a worthwhile goal, you're right. And we'd love to have you join the fight. So please check out the NORML website. That's NORML.org. Let me say that again. NORML.org. That is all the time we have for this week. I'd like to thank our host, Keith Stroup, for joining us from National NORML headquarters in Washington, D.C., and encourage you to tune in each week for the latest in marijuana news. Once again, this is the Keith Stroup Show. I'm Mikel Weisser, and you've been listening to Cannabiz News. Shout out to this week's sponsor, UltraTrust.net, for their support. Rocco Beatrice Sr., the founder of UltraTrust, is one of the nation's foremost experts on asset protection. His articles can be seen in USA Today, ABC News, CBS News, Fox News, and many more. Rocco can help you protect your assets from seizure, creditors, legal actions of all kinds, and hide them from prying eyes. Visit Rocco online at ultratrust.net, where you can download his free report, Managing the Risk of Loss, and learn numerous ways to protect your assets. That's ultratrust.net, ULTRATRUST.net.